Hi, I'm Ted Pattison of Critical Path Training. In this video, we're going to look at building SharePoint 2010 workflows with the SharePoint Designer. Now, the SharePoint Designer is far improved from what we had in the SharePoint Designer in 2007. So, the first big improvement with the bullet at the top of the charts is now you can create workflows that are reusable, which was just about impossible and for the most part impractical to do with SharePoint Designer 2007. As you went through their wizard, you created a workflow on list 1. Because of the hard-coded GUIDs, it was, for all practical purposes, not worth even trying to reuse that on list 2. We'd simply go through the wizard again and follow the exact same steps. So because of improvements to the workflow architecture inside of SharePoint and then complementary improvements to the SharePoint Designer, I can now create a workflow that can be reused on every list and document library throughout the site. So that gets to be a huge improvement. Furthermore, there's going to be a much better design experience. Instead of having a simple wizard, we have a full-blown workflow designer. And as I create custom tasks, that's complemented by a full-blown task process designer. If I want, I can add InfoPath forms or .aspx forms as I'm creating my workflows. And also, there's an improvement in the fact that I can begin modeling my workflows with a Visio diagram, and then I can export and import that diagram into SharePoint Designer. Now, if I take a look at the Designer, when I create a new workflow, I have the ability to add as many steps as I want, and then there's going to be an insertion point, and I can add actions and conditions and have a very natural look to what I want to see down below. Also, we have the ability to add nested logic, a step inside of a step, which was virtually impossible to do without doing backflips in the SharePoint Designer 2007. Also, when it's time for me to create a task, there's a task process designer, which allows me to start with a fairly robust task that has a approved and rejected outcome, and I can easily add a new task outcome, which will put a new logic path and a new button on my task edit form. So lots of improvements. The other thing to see is that there is this new life cycle of a workflow where you can start it in Visio. You can basically create a new Visio document based on their SharePoint workflow template, and you can start modeling your business process in a way that's very easy to visualize. You can then export it and move it into the SharePoint Designer. You can work for a while in the SharePoint Designer, and if you want, export it and import it back into Visio and go basically 2 ways, as many times as you'd like. Now, there's also the ability to take a workflow created with the SharePoint Designer and export it, and then in a one-time process, import it into a Visual Studio SharePoint Tools project, which for all practical purposes can let you mock things up and prototype in the SharePoint Designer when you ultimately want to have the power and strength of Visual Studio to provide the implementation. Okay, so let's get in and create a workflow with a SharePoint Designer. Okay, so here I am on my development workstation, and I have this test site that I'm working with. It's a simple blank site. It's got a couple lists inside of it. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up the SharePoint Designer, and I'm going to go ahead and open up this test site. Now, the first thing I'll do is I'll look at the workflows collection. And here's 3 workflows that are included out of the box: the approval workflow, the collect feedback and collect signature workflows that just ship as part of SharePoint Server. And what's entirely different about them in 2010 compared to how they were in 2007 is now you can open one of these and configure it additionally with the SharePoint Designer. Now here's a workflow that I created earlier. Now when I want to create a workflow, I could say create a list workflow, and notice it shows me the different lists. And so this would be the way that I would create a workflow right on a particular list that I wouldn't need to reuse. Just an ad hoc, create the workflow, attach there, provide business logic. There's also a reusable workflow. If I create a reusable workflow, so this is Ted's reusable workflow. Note that you don't point it to a list. Instead, you point it to a content type. So, as an example, if I created mine based on the content type announcements, I could create a workflow that I could then use on any announcements list throughout the entire site collection. If I want to make it even more reusable, well, I could basically create a workflow with a SharePoint Designer based on the item content type. And as you know, every item and every document gets created from a content type that inherits from item. So you would effectively create a workflow that you could reuse on any item or any document throughout the site collection. Of course, the trade-off is that if you create it based on the announcements type, your workflow can use columns such as body and expires in addition to title. If you create a workflow template to make it reusable based on item, the only guarantee that you have is that you have a column called title. Well, in this demo, I want to create a site workflow, which is a brand new target in SharePoint 2010. Let's go ahead, create this new workflow, and we'll just say, hello workflow. We'll create this new workflow, and here is the designer. So let's go ahead and take this step, and I'll just go ahead and say Ted's step. And note that as I'm working inside here, there's this notion of the insertion point, or I can just start typing. Now, I see the insertion point. Let's go up here to Actions, and let's just do Hello World by saying, let's log to History List. So we'll go through here, and we'll add a message, and the message will be Hello Workflow. Now, just to run the first workflow, all I have to do is go back and click on this Publish button. That's what pushes the workflow back into the SharePoint site. So once I've pushed this back here, let's go back to our site. Let's drop down the Site Actions menu, and what we should see here is that there is a Site Actions menu for site workflows. I go ahead, I click this, there's my Hello Workflow. Let's go ahead and run an instance of this workflow. Well, there is a workflow initiation form, not very exciting. Does have a start button. So we'll go ahead and we'll run this, and the workflow runs to completion. And if I look at the workflow and I drill down to see the status page for that workflow instance, well, there's my message, Hello World. Okay, so that's our first pass. Let's do something a little bit more complicated. So back here, let's go ahead and go up to the initiation form parameters. And so let's add some things inside here. Well, first of all, let's ask the user for their name. So we'll say username, and we'll ask the user for a single line of text. There's no good default value. And then we'll say something such as, do you love SharePoint 2010? And this will be a yes/no question. So we'll go ahead and add that inside. So now that we've done that, the default answer will obviously be yes. Let's now go and make a couple changes. First of all, what we're writing to the event log or the history list, let's change that from this generic hello workflow to hello, and we'll say hello to the user by coming down here and saying add or change lookup. Let's go to the parameters that we're going to ask the user to type in and grab the user's name. Okay, so now that we have that, we have our first action inside. Now, let's go ahead and add something else inside there. So I can either type inside here, or notice that we have an insertion point right inside. Let's now go and have a condition. If any value equals, and what is the value? So what we want to do is we want to put in some value right here, and that is, do you love SharePoint 2010? If that equals a value of yes, well, let's go ahead and put something else inside here. Let's go ahead and just, for simplicity, we'll go ahead and say log to history list, and we'll say I do too. And if they don't, we can put something down here, something else. But I think that's enough to basically show the point. So now, once again, let's go ahead and publish. We publish this back to the SharePoint site. Now that we've done that, let's go kick off another instance of the workflow that we're building out. We'll go to Site Workflows once again, and we'll start this up. This time, it brings up this, do you love SharePoint? I'll say yes. What is my name? Teddy P. We'll go ahead and choose Start. And now that we do that, it runs our workflow. It basically reads my input value. And I should be able to go down here, and it says, hello, Teddy P. And because I love SharePoint, the workflow told me I do too. And so, just to recap, I was using the Workflow Designer inside the SharePoint Designer. And when I create workflows, I can create them on a specific list. I can create a reusable workflow based on a content type, or I could create a workflow at the site level. And once I did that, I was able to add initiation parameters that prompt the user for information as the workflow starts, and I was able to read and act on those values the user put in as my workflow ran.